The distressed tone knifed through the ash hiss of the storm band, the way honest panic always cuts noise. Triple tap, pause, triple tap, the old sailor's plea that says someone is still thinking on the far end of ruin. Jocks Calder, third-generation scraper with more scarred hull plates than friends, pivoted the Peregrine into the wind lane and let the doomed thermals sling him down toward the signature blooming over the iron mesas of Cord. A mining moon that wrote its laws on dust and forgave nothing. Wreckage sprawled like a punctuation mark, flung too hard. A gutted transport kilometers long, hull torn as if the sky had remembered claws. Life support flickering in the red cadence of last chances and short prayers. He should have logged the ping and kept flying, because smart men who like breathing don't dock to ships that still remember violence. But 20 years of bad impulses had taught him a trick. Sometimes the right thing is the only thing that lets sleep return. Peregrine on hot approach, he told no one, because no one answers out here, and he burned the last of his clean thrust to kiss the aft spine before gravity remembered him. Inside the breach, the air tasted like metal and oaths. Gravity stuttered like a drunk hymn, and the corridor sang with stressed plates and cables crackling themselves into ghosts. The triple tap again, closer command deck bulkhead, manual override panel blinking old-fashioned patience, as if the universe still respected lovers. He burned through 2 fused latches, bridged a severed logic line with a strip of tool belt copper, and the door remembered how to be a door, groaning open on a room that had decided not to die politely. She filled it, 9 feet if she was a ruer, blue-gray skin carrying dim traceries of bioluminescent script like quiet constellations under frost. Shoulders an erect officer's harness, eyes of liquid silver that held the hard calm of someone who schedules fear for later. Her 4-fingered hand cradled a memory core caged in impact gel. The other hand rested near a tool that was not quite a weapon and exactly dangerous enough. Human, she said, syllables braided with harmonics his ears weren't built to deserve. Then switched to trade cant with a professional shrug. Jocks, he said, lowering his cutter the way you lower your voice in a church. And none of this is rated for another 10 minutes of noble stubborn. She tilted her head, considered, and nodded like a commander counting lives against maps. They moved as 2 problems pretending to be a team. Her long stride edited for the Peregrine's cramped corridors, his shorter frame making paths through the choking bric-a-brac of a dying ship's last arguments with physics. A ceiling rib gave up with a howl. She caught it like an insult, set it aside gently, and for a heartbeat he understood why myths exaggerate. They leapt the final shearing in the aft spine as atmosphere made its bid for elsewhere, slammed the docking collar, and he punched burn with everything the Peregrine had left, hauling free just as the transport's back half folded into a flower of useless fire in the thin air over Cord. Your vessel is inelegant, she observed, ducking twice to keep from redesigning his ceiling, but deliberate. It gets me where I'm needed, he said, trying not to notice his hands shaking, and set course for the canyon where his hab squatted like an apology. What do I call you? He asked, because names are bridges. Lear Veth, she said, and the harmonics in her voice put weight on the syllables the way titles do when they forget to hide. Lear, he repeated, tasting the shape of not alone. Wind dragged night across the canyon as they sealed the hab. A converted cargo box with reliable air and unreliable charm. And he heated protein and poured water in the ritual that says I do not intend harm. Why answer? She asked finally, silver gaze on his ruin of a table, on the old service patch he still used as a coaster, on the cutter he had not put far from reach. Because the universe keeps score in ways money doesn't, he said, and let the truth sit there until the room adopted it. She checked a wrist device that did not want to admit it was military, watched the door like the future might be early, and asked questions that mapped trade lanes and sketched rumor into intelligence with a professional's thrift. When he offered her the bunk, she took the floor by the door, back to the wall, eyes half-lidded and utterly awake, and he fell into a sleep that felt less like escape and more like a truce he hadn't known he needed. Dawn found her gone, the lock untripped, the air tasting of cold metal and the slight, impossible sweetness she'd brought in with her, a single translucent scale left on his pillow that glowed faintly, as if remembering a star. The canyon shook to the kind of engine note that makes animals hide and men choose sides. And Jacques' scopes lit with a formation that should not visit places like his unless purpose had grown teeth. 12 escorts and a flagship that moved with the insultingly casual grace of old money and newer math sat down in the flats like a god deciding to be polite. And the dust halo around them looked like a crown made from other people's decisions. The knock on his hab door was firm and ceremonial, as if it had rehearsed at academies. And when he opened it, the canyon grew smaller to make room for the person on his stoop. He was older than rank and carried a worse-scarred blue skin inked with the darker sigils of campaigns that hadn't ended properly. Uniform dense with decorations and utility, eyes that matched his daughter's and had learned harder lessons. Jacques Calder, the giant said in trade, voice clean as a blade laid flat. I am High Admiral Saros Veth of the Vethic Concord, and you pulled my daughter from fire. Jacques' mouth failed the first test. He found it later and said, she walked out with me. I just held the door. 12 guardians behind the Admiral held still in that moving way elite soldiers do, and one stepped forward with a case that looked like a promise you could carry. In our law, Saros said, you've incurred a star debt and earned a kin mark, either of which would be enough to crowd a life. You may choose which weight to wear, or refuse both at cost. He opened the case. Inside, a crystalline device shimmered like captured winter, metal collaring it in shapes that shifted as if embarrassed by attention. Kin mark confirms you as guest of line to House Veth, the Admiral said evenly, with protection, rites of passage, and duties that arrive with the same regularity as dawn. The star debt, he continued, is simpler and heavier. If you take it, the Concord owes you until you ask a thing that can be done without breaking us. And you owe us one answer when we call. Jacques looked at the device, at the soldiers, at the canyon-turned parade ground, and felt the old ache in his chest that opens when purpose knocks and you remember the price of saying yes. Lear stepped from the flagship then, tall in a uniform that gave up trying to make her smaller. Biolume script brighter now that lives were watching, gaze on him with that same measured warmth that had held the wreck together last night. Raiders have been sold routes and schedules, she said without prelude, and human signatures stain the data. They will take more if we let them. Saras's mouth flattened. We offer bounty against the network that bled us, he said. Coin, warrants, and a clean ledger for whoever brings us their spine. Choose to stand in it, and your debt to us and ours, to you resolve and work, which is the only honest arithmetic. Jacques sparked a laugh, because terror needed room. You came to my yard with a fleet and a job posting, he said. We came with gratitude and a door, the Admiral corrected, not unkind, and with a warning. The men who sold us may come for you to tidy their books. Somewhere under the quips and the dust, Jacques found his answer trying on its voice. He asked for an hour, because men who say yes too quickly often regret the speed and not the noun. And Saros gave it with the grace of someone who knows leverage without needing to use it. Lear lingered as the Admiral turned away, the canyon heat making ghost halos around her shoulders. The scale I left, she said, eyes on the ridiculous metal sky, marks a bond of witness in my line. It means I expect to see you again and intend to act accordingly. I don't speak your law, Jacques said, but I know a promise when it warms a room. He walked the edge of the canyon while the fleet pretended not to watch. Boots writing small arguments in dust, he'd be the only one to read later, and counted the lives he might save against the ones that would expect saving tomorrow. His old service patch itched through his shirt like memory with opinions, and he thought about the nights he'd mistaken quiet for freedom, about the way the hab sounded when there was another breath in it, about the transport's last groan in the hand that had set a ceiling rib aside as if weight were personal. He returned before the sun found its nerve, stood under the flagship's shadow like a man choosing to be small for a reason, and nodded once. Give me the job and the rules, he said, voice steady, because sometimes steadiness is all you own. Saros inclined his head as if gravity had just done something acceptable. Then take the kin mark, he said, so my enemies know whose roof you stand under, and take our bounty not as payment for a rescue, but as fuel for a hunt. The device warmed against Jacques' chest with a pulse that sensed to something he'd left behind years ago. And the canyon, his small, poor, honest canyon, learned a new word, we. The kin mark fused to Jacques' sternum with a warmth that was less burn than belonging, a crystalline rhythm sinking to his heart, like a second opinion that agreed too often. Concord medics checked his blood oxygen, his inconvenient humanity, and the old shoulder that forecast weather, then gave him a band of woven metal that knew how to sit politely under shirts and armor. Sarasveth didn't do ceremony long. Briefing, he said, and the flagship's tactical cradle unfolded around Jocks like a cathedral that understood math. Hollow threads spun a patient constellation of recent raids, cut corridors, ambushed freighters, a kidnapped nursery ship that had been rescued late enough to change everyone involved. Routes and schedules leaked from inside, Lear said, voice measured as a metronome. Human encryption on 3 packets. Hybrid ordnance on 2 attacks, your designations call it Mars. Uprising doctrine. Jocks's jaw found old anger like a favorite tool and remembered how to lift it. Web doctrine, he said. He taught mercs to think they were clever. He's clever enough to sell it and survive. Shame adjacent, Jocks said dry. I refused a thing he found profitable. Hood, the Admiral said. We prefer refusal with spines. Their first strike was not glamour. It was work. Lear's unit hit a relay nest on the far side of Cord, while Jocks rode shotgun in the Peregrine, because sometimes the best bait is a ship that looks too small to matter and turns out to have read the syllabus. They let the raiders chase in through a canyon grid only locals love, then folded the grid behind them with shaped charges that sighed like justice. Close range taught him more about Lear than briefing rooms had. She moved like restraint with permission, used force like punctuation, and watched her people with the kind of attention that keeps counts and remembers names afterward. He kept up not by speed, but by intention. Covering angles physics forgot when it got excited, calling audibles when Rock remembered being a teacher. Broker called Haffel red, he stammered. Human, uses our channels, your codes, has a laugh like sand. Where? Jocks asked. Drift Station 3 spokes. He meets on the cold spoke because he thinks romance is the same as danger. Bled the node of data and mercy and left it standing with enough power to call for rescue. On the ride back, Jocks caught Lear what? I make it smaller, he said. Useful is what good officers do. Her mouth bent in. What he was learning was humor. We have a word for people who deflect with compliments. It translates to keeps me. At 3 spokes, the plan was simple and wrong in 3 exciting ways. Go in quiet. Confirm Haffel red. Lift him before the room learned a new emotion. A station smelled like old oil and newer perfume. Humans and Vethic, and the in-between traded necessities and lies, while a band tried to teach the air a rhythm it didn't want. I upgraded my neighbors, Jocks said, and the room did that thing where all the wrong people suddenly have hands. The lift went sideways and then down. Haffel had hired muscle with better reflexes than loyalty. Lear's guards had reflexes that owed her their lives. The cold spoke filled with fog as pipes hissed their opinions about plasma fire. Jocks took a stunner to the ribs and a memory to the head when Haffel smiled exactly like Webb used to before a bad idea. They didn't get half foul. He cut a hatch and prepped a burn that would have taken half the spoke if Lear hadn't kicked the charge through the hatch like a lesson sent back unread. The explosion etched new policy into station law. They did get a drive shard from Haffel's pocket-scratched, encrypted, arrogant. Back on the flagship, Concord cryptographers frowned respectfully at its audacity. The kin mark on Jocks's chest pulsed once, and he realized his heartbeat had sped not from fear, but from the sudden shape of a path. Give me 10 minutes, he said, fingers already tearing into a stack of old human heuristics Webb loved. 8 minutes later, the shard unlocked like a door that had been waiting for someone to apologize correctly. Coordinates bloomed, a dead refinery in the shadow of Cord's smallest moon. A perfect place to think you were hidden if you hadn't learned humility yet. They went light and fast Peregrine as a lure, 2 Concord lances riding high, Lear in armor that wore her like a suggestion. The refinery looked like neglect and sounded like plans. Jocks put the Peregrine down in the main yard and opened his hatch the way you open a conversation in a bar you'll have to fight your way out of. Haffel came with 6 and a grudge. He tried charm, then price, then the kind of threat men use when they've forgotten the shapes of consequences. Jocks gave him the old service shrug that says, I know too much of you to be afraid, and burned the time he needed for Lear's team to finish the math. It should have been simple. It wasn't. Webb arrived, not in person, but in doctrine made flesh. A column of Merc boats using his staggered Carlson variant, a formation Jacques could unspool in his sleep and had hoped never to see running against people he'd chosen. Contact, Lear said, voice steady. Saras's lances pivoted. The yard turned into a problem set with lasers. Jacques felt something ugly and useful rise in him. Saras, he said on the net, authorize me units 7 through 12. We'll cut their left wheel and take their teeth. The Admiral didn't ask if he was sure. Done, he said, and there it was again, a trust that felt like a physical place to stand. Jacques spoke Merc in a language of vectors and petty egos. He baited the hotheads, cooled the cautious, and pushed Webb's timing 1/2 beat off the groove that made his doctrine sing. Lear's lance drove the wedge. Saras's ships closed the pocket. The refinery's comms tower learned humility at speed. Hoffel tried to run. Jacques didn't chase. He boxed. Lear took him at the fence with a grace that made physics consider retirement. She didn't gloat. She cuffed and catalogued. Broker in hand, she said, and even the refinery rats stopped to admire professionalism. On the deck, with prisoners quiet and ships cooling, Saras studied the battle plot, and then Jacques. You will have to speak to your human law, he said, not unkindly. Your Webb will come dressed in papers and friends. He'll come dressed in favors, Jacques said. But you brought a ledger. He tapped his kin mark, and I have a roof. Hoffel laughed once, a sound that wanted to be cynical, and couldn't get there. You think the Concord courts scare Webb? No, Jacques said. I think recording you offering to sell nursery roots scares donors who like their secrets tidy. Lear held up a recorder the size of a sign. Hoffel looked smaller. Back aboard, Lear found Jacques in the hangar, checking the Peregrine with the affectionate brutality mechanics reserve for things that have earned it. You knew Webb would be here, she said, not accusing. I knew his doctrine would, Jacques said. He always shows up where the math flatters him. Today, we are unflattering. Will you face him? I've been facing him by avoiding him for years, Jacques said. Time to stop being clever and start being finished. Saras offered him formal protection. Jacques accepted the informal kind standing between Lear and the rest of the galaxy as if it were a reasonable place to keep watch. The Admiral watched both of them with the mild despair of fathers who recognize the trajectory and find it acceptable. Night over Cord's moon is a thinner thing than night on worlds with oceans. Stars felt closer and less sympathetic. Lear stood with him at the hangar rim. Iolune's script dimmed to the color of trust. When you took the kin mark, she said, did you choose us or choose yourself back? Yes, Jacques said. She made the Vithic laughter, that layered harmony he was learning to miss before it stopped. The shard yielded one more gift before the cryptographer shut it up. An appointment time. A vector, a ship with Webb's prints all over the doctrine of its approach. Saras called the op in a voice that made rooms straighten. We will meet him where he believes we cannot. Jacques checked the Peregrine seals, his sidearm, and the kin mark's quiet pulse. Let's end the part that hurts strangers, he said, and begin the part that builds neighbors. Lear finished. Webb chose the kind of ground men pick when they mistake clever for wise, an old oar tether looping a rock. Cluster in Cord's high shadow, where censor ghosts write poems and bad doctrine feels original. He came in with 12 and a sermon. Saros came with 9 and a plan that didn't need adjectives. Jacques came with the Peregrine, a ship that looked like a bad choice right up until it wasn't. Calder, Webb's voice oiled across the channel, friendly as a lone shark. Heard you went native. Went neighbor, Jacques said. Cost less. I can still cut you a slice, Webb offered. I've got sponsors who prefer outcomes to ethics. We prefer outcomes with ethics, Lear replied, voice flat enough to be dangerous. Saras cut the chatter. Begin. Jacques didn't outgun Webb. He outtimed him. He took the doctrine Webb loved and subtracted the part where Webb believed his opponents would behave like students. He drove Unit 7 across the tether's blind cone on a vector that looked suicidal and was merely rude. He let 8 and 9 lag into the pocket arrogance leaves. He asked Lear to put a lance where the math said, don't, and she said, now. The tether sang as grapnels missed. Webb's left flank folded into the polite embrace of vacuum. His right tried to improvise and discovered it had never been paid to think. The center saw Saras Veth bearing down with the ancient resolve of a man who has buried too many and refuses to schedule another funeral. Webb tried to burn through the old Mars trick that wins bar stories and loses nephews. Jocks anticipated the boast and was already beside him, Peregrine's nose almost touching Webb's viewport like a stern lecture. "Hi, Marcus," Jocks said on a tight beam. "I brought your past." "You brought a leash," Webb sneered, eyeing the kin mark. "How's it feel?" "Like a roof," Jocks said, and flipped the Peregrine on axis to show Webb the 3 Concord lances settling into positions that named this place consequence. "Stand down and testify," Jocks said. "You'll rot softer." "Or," Webb said, smile sharpening, "we both leave with our myths intact." He spiked a charge at the tether junction, the one weak point that would turn the field into shrapnel and write epitaphs for everyone. Lear moved before Jocks spoke, which is what trust looks like when it has learned your breath. Her ship slid between the charge and the junction. Her shields took the bite. Saras's beam lanced the charge into steam. The tether shuddered and decided to remain history instead of headline. Webb ran. He'd always been better at exits. Jocks let him for 8 seconds, enough rope to hang a story on, then cut him off with a vector that ended in physics and a docking collar. He didn't kill him. He put a recorder on the line and asked questions in a voice Webb would recognize from nights when they had been almost friends. "Who paid for nursery roots? You think I kept ledgers where you could find them?" Webb laughed without heat. "Donors, politicians, a star priest or 2. I sold them safety and bought drones. Names. You don't get names today," Webb said, showing the old talent for making other men hate him slowly. "You get a choice. Turn me over to Concord Justice and watch your human courts cry sovereignty, or airlock me and make it simple." Saros came on the line, voice a granite kindness. "We do not airlock problems because they embarrass us." Jocks felt vengeance rise and fade like a tide that had learned literacy. "You taught me to break formation to look heroic," he said to Webb, almost gentle. "I'm going to finish by holding the line." He slaved the recorder to 4 redundant channels and read Webb his rights under 2 legal codes that had never expected to meet. Back on the flagship, Saros looked at Jocks for a long moment and then nodded once, the ritual of commanders who approve so much they can't afford to say it out loud. Lear stood beside Jocks, shoulder almost touching in a way that felt like a treaty written in skin. The hearings were ugly in the expected ways and honest in the ones that matter. Concord prosecutors arraigned Webb on charges with names like mercenary piracy and trafficking in routes. Human envoys arrived with briefcases full of concern and phrases like jurisdictional complexity. Saras's staff built bridges where old grudges expected walls. Hoffel read flipped first, because brokers love freedom more than employers. His depositions named donors, who practiced charity with one hand and bought leverage with the other. Concord law moved fast, where human law liked to calendar dignity. The compromise wrote itself in weary ink. Concord would try the crimes against Concord. Humans would strip Webb's patrons of their quiet immunities. Jocks testified once brief, plain, like a hinge that had finally learned to be silent. He said why he answered a beacon when 11 others didn't. He said what it feels like when a friend sells maps to nursery ships. He didn't say hero. He said neighbor. The room learned the difference. The admiral paid his bounty in a way that didn't feel like coin. He placed a small case on the table in Jax's hab, same humble cargo box, no gravity. Inside lay a second band, this one bearing the Vethic sigil worked small enough to be intimate. Guest of line is a roof, Saros said. Citizen by deed is a door, if you wish it open. Jax looked at the band, at the hab that had stopped echoing, at the life he would have described as freedom until he met a better noun. I have one condition, he said. Saros's eyebrow did a thing that meant both amusement and attention. I don't give up being human, Jax said. I don't stop fixing the parts of us that break other people. Good, Saros said. Keep that job. We are poor at it. He pressed the band into Jax's hand. Welcome, Twice. That night, Lear brought him to a high balcony on the flagship where the stars felt close enough to negotiate. Among my people, she said, witness marks bonds stronger than vows spoken for the benefit of rooms. You witnessed me and chose us. Will you witness this? She held up a scale translucent, etched with the story of a wreck in a canyon and a tether that refused to become shrapnel. Jocks touched the kin mark. It warmed as if agreeing to an old plan. Yes, he said, because some words work best when they are simple. They didn't name what stood between them. They fed it. They let it work. They taught it the schedules of danger and the habits of rest. Saras pretended not to notice, which is the most generous oversight a father can exercise. Weeks slid into a life measured by patrol routes and repair logs, and the laugh Jocks could pull from Lear without endangering anyone. The nursery ships traveled without drama. The raider tags went quiet or respectable. Concord and human courts exchanged prisoners and recipes. The canyon got a new roof out of sentiment and engineering. On a quiet cycle, a beacon cut through static. Cargo crippled in an asteroid lane. No strategic value, only people. Jocks set the course before Saras said the word. Lear buckled in with the practiced patience of someone who had been expecting this answer since the first night in the canyon. You never hesitate, she said. I learned from a giant, he said, and the kin mark kept time with the Peregrine's old faithful engines. Concord training worlds do not romanticize competence. They schedule it. Arden 3 was a cold green moon, laced with stone academies and forests used to listening. Jocks arrived in a jacket that had known Cord's dust and a kin mark that made doors forget to be suspicious. Orientation tasted like humility. Vethic history in 4 harmonized voices. Law recited as stories about neighbors rather than punishments. Tactics taught under a sky that changed to show you what arrogance forgets. Humans washed out for speed. Vethic washed out for rigidity. Jocks learned to slow, and Lear learned to bend, and both of them laughed more than the younger cadets expected from legends still breathing. Language came easy, courtesy of a neural gloss that felt like permission instead of theft. Culture came slower. The way Vethic touch meant treaty. How silence could mean praise. How an officer's job was not to be obeyed, but to make obedience unnecessary by designing rooms that kept people honest. Saras visited rarely and precisely, bringing problems wrapped as drills. Piracy in a fog archipelago, he'd say, and the instructors would make weather. Diplomats with sharp smiles, and the cadets would be required to serve tea. Jocks discovered he could be patient on purpose. Lear discovered she could be unkind to doctrine and kind to people in the same afternoon. Final proofs were not exams. They were useful. A convoy of med barges needed shepherding through a debris belt, or old satellites had learned spite. The route planner had missed a timing quirk. The belt pulsed every 91 minutes in a way that would shear a slow barge like gossip. Jocks found the groove and taught the med pilots to dance. Lear organized the escort into a rhythm that made collisions rethink their habits. At the celebration quiet, with Stu and a ledger of almosts an instructor, asked Jocks what he missed from the life he'd chosen against. The lie that solitude is freedom, he said. The room, which had learned to stack chairs without gloating, nodded. That night, Lear brought him to a hall with a window that overlooked a dark ocean wrinkled by moons. My line keeps witness here, she said, touching a panel that told stories in light. I want your mark on it. Jocks pressed his palm to the glass. The kin mark warmed. A thin line of silver wrote his name and a simple noun. Neighbor orders came quietly, always the right volume for work. A human sector court had scheduled depositions on Webb's patrons. Concord asked for a liaison who spoke both law and logistics, and didn't spook easily. Saras looked at Lear and Jocks and said, You like chairs. Bring some. The capital world that hosted the hearings had learned to monetize urgency. Lobbyists smelled of good soap and old power. Journalists tried to turn witness into plot. Jocks wore the kin mark under a shirt and a patience under that. Lear wore a uniform that redefined audience expectations. The first attempt came in the corridor outside a briefing room. A press of bodies, a whistle of compressed air, something hungry groping for the kin mark's signature. Kate Jocks' sister, newly seconded to Concord Logistics, put an elbow in the right sternum at the right time, and the would-be thief learned about floors. Family rates, she said, breathless, and Jocks hugged her with the ferocity of men who forget to do so until the moment arrives. Inside, the hearings unfolded like a puzzle half-solved. Hoffel's testimony burned the camouflage off donors who had mistaken secrecy for morality. A senator tried to filibuster a question into tedium. Lear asked it again in Vethic, which has fewer places to hide. The judge, a woman who could stack her own chairs, smiled privately, and said, "Answer." Between sessions, the invitation came, a private dinner with stakeholders, the kind that buy verbs. Saras advised attendance with eyes open. Jocks attended with the kin mark off and the recorder on. The host proposed a compromise that tasted like ash clemency for donors in exchange for future cooperation. Jax poured water and said, "Future cooperation begins with past receipts." Lear watched the room measure him and come up short. The compromise died on the table, which is where some things deserve to die. The court issued orders that turned fortunes into schools and private docks into public clinics. Web sponsors discovered that immunity is not an element and cannot be mined. On departure day, the Raiders' last cousin tried a theatrical revenge small bomb, big audience. Lear spotted the twitch in a courier's hand. Jocks called "freeze" in a voice that reminded a dozen people of mothers. Cade stripped the charge and handed it to a bailiff as if returning a library book slightly overdue. The crowd applauded badly, which is the best way. Back aboard the flagship, Saros called them to a smaller room than ceremony would have chosen. He set a box on the table. Inside, a badge shaped like a doorway and a new designation. "Taskwing Witness," he said. "You will go where beacons stutter and laws don't match. And you will do exactly what you have been doing. Make rooms honest, rescue on schedule, keep our promises boring." Jocks closed his hand around the badge and felt the kin mark answer. "We'll need more chairs," he said, "and better stew," Lear added. Sarah smiled in that small private way commander's own. Approved. Taskwing Witness took its first call on a colony that loved theatrics more than air. A terraplate quake had sheared a commuter tram, trapping 30 in a vault under a municipal plaza designed by someone who hated exits. The governor declared a ceremony of rescue. Lear declared a plan. Jocks declared chairs. By the time the flagship settled, the square had sprouted scaffolds and reporters. A banner read "Heroism Live." Lear squinted at it as if the word might apologize. "We prefer competence recorded late," she said. Jocks smiled because she was getting good at human. The vault sat under a load-bearing arch. The quake had taught to gossip. The normal approach cut, brace, lift would turn the plaza into a memorial. Lear mapped a Vethic approach that used resonance to convince the arch to wait. Jocks tuned the cutters to a frequency stone respected. The governor insisted on opening remarks. Saras offered to time him. The remarks shrank. In the first hour, they freed 12, then 5 more, then hit a tangle of collapsed ductwork that translated to human as bad television. The networks tried to pivot to danger. Jocks pivoted to tea. He put the camera on a medic, handing a child a cup. The feed's numbers dipped, and then rose with better people. A slab shifted. Lear moved "there is no better verb," and caught 2 tons of civic pride on her back while a brace seated. The crowd gasped the way crowds always do when physics meets someone who has trained for it. A reporter shouted, "Hold for the shot." Jocks glared and said, "Hold for the brace." The brace held. Halfway through, a counselor tried to redirect the effort toward the cameras. "Cut here," he insisted, "where the light was best and the risk was lethal." Lear looked at Jocks. Jocks handed the counselor a hard hat and pointed at the chair stack. "Help," he said. The counselor helped. Cameras learned silence. They reached the last pocket just as the arch remembered it was heavy. Jocks wedged the final prop, hands raw, voice raw. "Mostly safe," he told Lear, which among professionals means dangerous, but honest. She nodded and slid through the gap like a story, committing to an ending. When the last survivors came up, the governor tried to pivot to podiums. Saros, who had arrived with a clipboard that radiated inevitability, announced a failure meeting. The crowd blinked and stayed. Witness now included them. The plaza meeting wrote itself. Almosts, chores, names. A foreman admitted he'd underfunded maintenance to please a budget. A child admitted he'd been brave because a giant told him it was allowed. The counselor who'd wanted a better angle brought water to the back row and learned to stack chairs. A journalist asked why Taskwing refused to do hero shots. Lear looked at Jocks. "We don't pose with gravity," he said. "It resents it." The line made the feed, and the next day the posters, which was not the point, but helped accountants find money for braces. In the quiet after cleanup, the governor presented medals that looked expensive. Saros accepted them with a politeness that meant auction later. The survivors brought stew that tasted like room saved. Jocks and Lear walked the perimeter, where the plaza met the sky. You carried a city, Jocks said finally. I carried a moment, Lear corrected. The city carried itself. He looked at her profile against the scaffold lights and said, You know what I meant? I do, she said softly. And I know what you meant earlier. In the canyon, she reached into her jacket and produced a scale, this one etched with 2 lines, a wreck and a vault. In my culture, a personal vow is not words. It is a schedule. This is mine. I will stand where you stand, unless you order me not to, and if you do, I will stand a step to your left. Jax's answer wasn't poetry. He held out the kin mark lanyard, unclipped a thin filament the medics used for identity sync, and looped it around the scale. My vow's the same, he said, except I'll take the right. Easier to draw from there. Practical romance, Lear said, which in Vethic is high praise. Their next dispatch came before dawn, a freighter adrift with failing spin, 3 dozen aboard, no drama, all need. The plaza lights cooled, and the square learned that sometimes the after is better than the during. Taskwing Witness lifted without fanfare, and with a shopping list, races, tea, and new chairs. Taskwing Witness was a schedule more than a unit. Rescue, report, repair, remember. After the plaza, the calls blurred into the kind of days that don't make reels and build civilization's depressurization caught early. A convoy rerouted before pirates remembered courage. A school roof fixed with donor money that used to buy excuses. Then a message came from Cord with a voice Jocks knew. A mine collapsed near his old canyon where a co-op he'd traded with had gone legit and learned paperwork. We've got 20 down, the foreman said, calm threaded with fatigue. Company sold us bad bolts. They'll send lawyers before loaders. Send chairs, Jax answered, and Saras signed the vector with a single word, go. Returning felt like measuring a scar that had healed right. The canyon wore new roofs and old honesty. The peregrine kissed dust with a little more ceremony than usual. Lear stepped onto Cord's ground with the ease of someone who had earned it. Locals who remembered the wreck and the fleet's shadow nodded without staring, because Cord respects competence over novelty. The mine didn't want to kill anyone. It wanted help. Jocks could hear it in the way Rock groaned resentful, not murderous. The plan was humane and unphotogenic. Vent, brace, cut in triangles. Pause every 30 seconds for the ground to find its manners. Lear crawled spaces engines envied. Cade ran the board, like a conductor who refused to accept tragedy as tempo. At hour 2, a support failed where the company had shaved metal into margin. At hour 3, a boy started a cry and swallowed it because men were watching. Lear told him giants cry on schedule and gave him the time. At hour 4, they broke through to a pocket where the last 6 huddled around a man, Jocks knew Morrow, who had once paid him in parts and promises. Late, Morrow rasped. Fashionably, Jocks said, voice breaking. They brought everyone up. The co-op's kitchen turned the canyon into gratitude that smelled like beans and courage. The company reps arrived with clipboards and moral injuries. Saras arrived with a memo and a grin. We're nationalizing your negligence, he told the reps. Into public safety fines. The judge who traveled with Taskwing wrote law on the hood of a loader and stamped it with dust. That night, Saras asked for the square. You have a word for what Jocks did when he dragged my daughter out of fire, he said, addressing miners who had no patience for titles and liked him better for it. You call it decent. In my house, we call it binding. He turned to Jocks and Lear. You have served my line and my people. If you wish it, I would have you serve them with names that do not belong to me. He produced a small case, no jewels. Just wait. 2 rings of tempered crystal, etched with a story. A wreck, a tether, a vault, a canyon. Vethic vows are schedules, Saras said. This one reads, share breath, schedule remembering, stay unless duty calls, and when duty calls, go together. Jocks looked at Lear, at the canyon that had given him back to himself, at the faces of people who measured worth in shifts and laughter. Yes, he said, because his life worked better when he used that word correctly. Also yes, Lear said, because translation sometimes improves on the original. There was no kiss on a dais. There was stew and tasks assigned. CAD on logistics, Morrow on bolts, miners on audits, Saras on donor letters, teenagers on chairs. The square set its own lights. Someone strung a banner that read Witness Day and spelled it wrong in a way no one wanted to correct. Morning after, the canyon wore the comfortable hangover of places that celebrated, for reasons that respect tomorrow. Jocks and Lear walked the tire scar path toward the Peregrine, packs slung, rings catching the thin sun, boots writing new sentences in old dust. "Do you regret leaving the quiet?" Lear asked, which is a question cultures ask each other when they're polite enough to risk truth. "I didn't leave it," Jocks said. "I brought it with me. We make it where we stop. Schedules as vows," she said, pleased. "You're becoming Vethic, heaping the parts that work," he said, touching the kin mark through his shirt. "And the parts that make us human enough to be annoying." They reached the ship. Saros was there, not looming, just present, hands behind his back, in the posture of commanders who've learned that presence is a tool. "The bounty I promised the day we crowded your yard," he said to Jocks, "was never coin. It was purpose with a roof. You chose it before I learned your name." Jocks shrugged the way men do when the room is trying to be ceremonial, and they are trying to be useful. "We've got a schedule. Then go make boring miracles," Saros said, "and send minutes." The Peregrine lifted. Cord fell away, wearing its scars with an honesty Jocks would teach other worlds if they let him. The job board chimed. Distress signal, low priority, family barge with a busted coil. Lear looked at him. He looked at her. They grinned the same grin. "Set the vector," he said. "Already did," she said. As the ship angled into the thin light, Cade's voice came overcome, bright with mischief. "Taskwing witness. Remember the photo the Cums kids wanted?" "We don't do hero shots," Jocks said. "This one's for the archive," Cade replied. Rear view, walking toward the ship, moon-huge outpost to the right. No faces, just the schedule. They obliged earlier, without knowing it, when they crossed the yard. The image went into the archive under the caption someone else chose. Two beings who made a roof and called it neighbors. On the way to the barge, they passed the wreck site where it had started, now quiet under a thin drift of new dust. Lear's hand found Jocks's across the console in a habit they would never call ritual. "Beacon," the comms officer said. "Cargo. No strategic value. People," Jocks answered. "All value." The Peregrine burned a line across the morning. The kin mark kept time. The universe, for once, seemed to approve of how small the next task was.